would need now, please, the slides of Justin Coombs.
Okay, thank you, Astrid, and also like to thank Boris and his colleagues for inviting us to such a beautiful location today for this conference. And so I have the difficult job of trying to convince you that talking about predatory pricing and rebates is more interesting than the marvellous view out of the window. And let me try and convince you of that by explaining some of the difficulties and challenges that you might face advising a company which is in a dominant position. And throughout this talk, I'm going to assume to start with that we are looking at firms who hold dominant positions, and we've already established that. So if you have a firm that holds a dominant position and it wants some advice on, well, how do I set my prices? Well, the first concern, as has already been mentioned, that you might have is, well, if its prices are too high, it's exploiting its dominant position, exploiting its customers, that might be a concern. Although in practice, when we look at case law in Europe, we find there are actually very few cases where firms have been found to be infringing the law by setting prices which are excessive and too high. The concern which we tend to find more commonly is the opposite, which is that prices are too low. And in particular, if prices are below cost, that might be viewed as being predatory and excluding competitors. So prices that are too high, that's a problem, possibly. Prices that are too low, that definitely could be a problem. And somewhere in between, there's some sort of green zone where we think, well, providing if we're pricing in this zone, then we're safe. But unfortunately, it's more complicated than that, because if a firm is using rebates or bundling or is vertically integrated and might be accused of a margin squeeze, then even if its prices are above cost and nowhere near being excessive, there might still be concerns that we have to be worried about. So what I'm going to try to do today is talk about where these risks might arise and how we might try and assess those risks. So what I'm going to do is firstly talk about the concept which has already been introduced of the equally efficient competitor test, and then talk about how that might be applied. And essentially applying that requires looking at two numbers. One is looking at the prices that the firm charges, and that can be more complicated than we might expect in some situations. And then we also have to look at the cost of the firm. And again, that's something which can be rather sort of complicated. So I'm going to look at both of these issues and some of the complications and difficulties that arise. So first of all, the equally efficient competitor test. So in the Commission's guidelines on Article 102 that have already been mentioned, the approach it adopts is basically based on this equally efficient competitor test. And the logic here is what the Commission is concerned about is they're concerned about practices by dominant firms which will lead to the exclusion of firms which are as efficient or more efficient than the dominant firm, because then that's going to lead to harm to the economy and harm to consumers. What they're not concerned about is they're not concerned about a situation where a firm is excluded from the market simply because that firm is less efficient than the dominant firm. That's the outcome that we expect from competition, is that less efficient firms get excluded. So what we do is we think about this situation where we have a dominant firm and it faces a competitor, which may be an existing competitor or a new entrant. And in order for it to actually survive in the marketplace, this competitor will have to charge prices which are no higher than the dominant firm. Unless it has some advantage in terms of quality of its products or services, then it's going to have to set prices which are no higher than the dominant firm. Otherwise, it's going to lose its customers to the dominant firm. So that's how it sets its prices. We then think about the fact that this firm is that we're concerned about. We're assuming that it's equally efficient, and what that effectively means is it has the same costs as the dominant firm. Its costs are either the same as the dominant firm or lower than the dominant firm's. In that sense, it's equally efficient. And what we do is we ask the question, well, suppose we have this competitor. It's got the same costs as the dominant firm. It's charging the same prices as the dominant firm. Can it actually cover its costs? And if it can, then that's fine, then that's good, there's no problem, no reason to intervene. But if not, if it can't cover its costs, then that suggests that this equally efficient firm is going to be excluded from the market, and that's going to be something that the Commission is going to be worried about, and that's the circumstances where the Commission would expect to intervene. So the nice, neat thing about this approach is that in principle we only need to know two numbers. We need to know what's the price being charged by the dominant firm and what are the costs of the dominant firm. And these are two things which, in principle, a dominant firm should know what its own prices and its own costs are, so it can self-assess to make sure it's complying with the law. That's the way things work in an ideal world. In the real world, things are far more complicated than that, and both assessing prices and assessing costs can turn out to be very complicated. So let me first of all talk about the issue of, well, how do you assess prices? And what I'm going to do is talk through a series of examples of issues that might arise: predatory pricing, volume-based rebates, and bundled rebates. And then Paolo will talk about margin squeeze. So first of all, in terms of predatory pricing, well, this is the case that is the relatively more straightforward case. If we're looking at an allegation of predatory pricing, then simply we look at the prices that are being charged to customers, compare those to costs. I'll come on in a moment to explain the complications about looking at costs. And if prices are above cost, we're okay. If prices are below cost, then we have a problem. That's the relatively simple situation. Second example is where we have a system of volume-based rebates. So a firm says to its customers, this is my price, but if you buy more than a certain quantity, I'm going to give you a rebate off that price. And these volume-based rebates come in two types, two flavours. The first is what we call an incremental rebate, which I've shown on this diagram here. So on this diagram, on the vertical axis, this is the price that the dominant firm is charging to the customer, and on the horizontal axis is the quantity that the customer is buying from the dominant firm. And if the customer buys a quantity below X, it pays a price P1. If it buys a quantity above X, then it will receive a rebate on its incremental purchases, on the volumes beyond X that it buys from the dominant firm. So it effectively pays price P1 up to the quantity X. Any quantity beyond X, it pays the lower price P2. So question here is, well, if we're thinking about an equally efficient competitor and it wants to compete for this customer, what price does it have to charge in order to entice this customer away from the dominant firm? Well, the price it will have to charge depends upon exactly what quantity it's competing for, but it's going to be some average of this price P1 and P2. It's going to be somewhere in between P1 and P2. In the most extreme situation, if the competitor isn't competing for the initial purchases up to X, it's only competing for quantities beyond X, then the price it's going to have to charge is P2. So simple test that we can do is, well, we take what we call the incremental price, the discounted price, P2, we compare that to costs, and if that price is above cost, then there should be no problem. If that price is below cost, then we have concerns. So in many ways, this is very similar to the situation with predatory pricing. We look at this incremental discounted price, use that as the price that we compare to costs.